Okay, great. Well, good morning again, everybody. What you can see here is a snapshot of a book which I read probably 10 or 12 years ago now, from an author that I've followed for quite a long time. He's a British guy, and he studies the brain, memory, creativity, and he's probably best known as the inventor of the mind map. That's a guy called Tony Buzan. Obviously a very humble guy, as you can see from the title of the book. He's created this book around a graph, and I believe that it was this graph that inspired him to go on to design and implement over all these years the mind map philosophy. So what I'm going to try and cover this in I think I have 6 slides here. I'm going to try and cover it. The book, in essence, shows you how to ensure people remember more of what you communicate. Now, we're all in the communication business, inside of work and outside of work. So I think it's an applicable tool and a good skill to understand. It draws on a lot of research. Some of the things that him and his company have researched themselves, it's pulled together some other research that you might be familiar with. And he's tried to put it all into a one graph format to explain this, how people learn, how people remember, how retention works. So that is on the right-hand side, you'll see a small snapshot of the graph. I'm sure it's all self-explanatory. It has been called the recall during learning graph. It incorporates elements of von Restorff effect, also the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. And if I go to slide 3, that's basically what the whole book's about. The whole book covers the content of that graph. So to try and explain it at a fairly high level, you've got the 2 axes. First of all, let me explain the axes. So the vertical axis is the amount recalled. The horizontal axis is the duration of the learning session. So whether it's a 1-hour class or a 2-hour research session, that bottom axis is the duration of that. If you look only at the blue curve, that's a typical curve which represents how we, the general population, would remember information in a given session. So you have the P, the beginning of that, which would be at the beginning of the learning, and you have the R at the end of that. If you just understand these 2 alone, there's probably some value. The P is the primacy effect. And what that tells you is items from the beginning of a learning session stand out more and are more memorable. Then the retention dips and then peaks at the end, which is the recency effect. Again, similar concept. Items from the end of a learning session are also more memorable. Examples of primacy would be, probably we all remember our first girlfriend or boyfriend. We probably all remember the first time we flew. And if you've ever been to the US, you probably remember the first time you went, if you've been multiple times. That's an example of the primacy effect. If you look at the R, the recency effect is, a good example of that would be, you probably all can remember the last meal you ate. If I was to ask you, can you remember 6 meals ago? Probably not. Using a similar example for primacy, if I was to ask you, can you remember what your 12th holiday was? Probably not, but you can remember the first. So the P and the R form the basis for this graph. And if you look at the other elements on there, I'll try and go through them with hopefully an example for each one to help understanding. The green U and the X is an interesting one. That is defined as understanding or misunderstanding based on your brain's ability to make connections and associations. Which is, in effect, what it's saying is it's possible to remember that which doesn't occur. And when I attended a training on this many years ago, the example given was he would list, Tony Buzan was taking the training, he would list a series of words, which he would then ask us questions. Did you remember this word? Did you remember that word? An example, the words would have been house, floor, wall, glass, roof. And he would ask, hands up, who remembered house? Who remembered floor? Who remembered window? And everyone put their hand up and he says, I never said window, I said glass. So people were remembering things which didn't occur. But that's just the way the brain works. It works in associations. Which takes us to the red A's. You can see 3 bars on that chart, A1, A2, A3. They just represent associations. We have a habit of remembering things that we can tie to other things in our own head. In other words, we can hook onto by making an association with something else. It looks to be a purple color, the star with VR. That's an abbreviation for von Restorff. The von Restorff effect, in essence, says, it's also known as the isolation effect, which I think better explains it. Things that stand out during a learning period are more likely to be remembered. So if you were to look in a box of eggs and there's all of them are white except one that's black, and I ask you how many black eggs were in that box, you would say 1. Why? Because it was outstanding. It was unique. It stood out. Well, that also applies with the memory. You can also see on there some eyes with blue arrows. And what that's telling you is interest. If you can keep interest high during a communication, what that will do, when I say during, I mean throughout a communication, what that will do is that will push the whole blue curve higher. So you'll still have a curve, but each element will be a little bit higher up there. So overall retention will improve. And I think that's the power where you see a lot of people using storytelling these days. It's to create interest around the subject, which will aid obviously in retention. And the last element to that chart is the face with the M on there. And that is standing for meaning or gestalt. So that's the moment during a learning session when you get that aha moment, when somebody says something which provides you the last piece of the puzzle that you've been looking for. Whenever you get a moment like that, typically whatever that comment was, or that word or that phrase was, you won't be forgetting it very soon in the future. It will stick with you. So that's a quick overview of the graph, and the whole book's in essence about this graph. I would strongly advise anyone who's interested to look for more information on it. I think the book is still available. Now, a little bit more information. There's 2 elements to this slide. One is the chart over to the left, which shows demonstrably the value of reviewing information over time. At what point you should review it. It also, I suppose you could say, it tells you how often to review it and what the results will be. And what that's showing you is, if you take the first line on that chart, that's showing that you start off with an 80% retention at best of what you learn. But as time moves on, it's going to move down to around 20%, and it will stay there. So you're going to learn or retain 1/5 of whatever it is you are studying, unless you decide to do reviews. And then you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 different reviews spaced out the next day, a week later, a month later, 3 months later, then 6 months later. which can lead to an 80% retention of all the data you studied. And the charts to the right, the top chart is basically the curve we just covered on the previous slide. That shows you the primacy and the recency as the peaks on that curve. That's where you're going to remember the most. So if you are typically doing a 30, 60, or 90-minute jam session from beginning to end, that curve would reflect pretty much your learning. You could take the same learning session, in this case it's 30 minutes we're looking at, break it into 3 sessions. The benefit there, if you look, you're getting 3 primacies and 3 recencies. So in theory, you're learning a lot more, or you're retaining a lot more, even though you're only spending the same amount of time in study. Okay, so we're all here from a business perspective, so it's nice that if it helps you in your day-to-day life, and if it helps you with talking to your children about learning, but how does it, or how can it apply to business? Well, I think a couple of weeks ago when John was doing his training session, he made the comment about how today you must have a PhD in your customer. So if you do, and as I think most of us do based on discussions to date, have niched down our clients to a level that we can better understand them and can better target them with content. Well, now it's manageable. Now, if you know how they're going to retain information, that's going to help in your marketing and your positioning of your marketing. If you're meeting with a client, as we're fortunate, hopefully fortunate enough to be doing in the very near future, when you're sitting with that client, you've got a better idea now over what to say, when to say it, how to say it. And just a point I'd bring up here with regard to primacy and recency effect, I think it's Toastmasters who tell you to say what you're going to say it, and then say what you've said. That's a perfect example of the primacy and the recency effect. You tell them at the beginning what you're going to say, you say it, and then effectively you summarize it at the end. You'll also see or hear a lot of the social media trainers online talking about follow-up. Many of them, like people like Jeff Walker, Russell Brunson, Dan Kennedy, talk about 3 email sequence. Well, again, just based on what we've quickly covered, you can see that follow-ups will effectively reinforce the client's recall of your discussion. It's like doing a revision after the event 24 hours later, or 1 week or 2 weeks, however it's spaced out. Again, when doing presentations, understanding the value of keeping the information succinct and on message. You've seen the 30-minute learning curve there with the P and the R. There's a lot of information gets lost in the middle. You're better off doing 3 10 minutes if you can break it up, or 2 10 minutes if you have to. Even though the time is less with the 2 10 minutes, the likelihood of the message being remembered is higher. And the last slide on this, this is a hack which I learned recently. I'm sure I have this attention deficit disorder because my ability to focus for extended periods of time is really bad. It's not what it used to be. If I do a 90-minute research session, invariably after 15, 20, 30 minutes, my mind starts to wander. A hack I learned was, I found it quite funny when I first read about it, but it's backed up with multiple research. After every 10 or 15 minutes, I set an alarm. When it goes off, I yawn and I stretch, no more than 30 seconds. And the very fact of yawning and stretching, what it does is effectively it's a soft reset for the brain. So it's not a hard reset where you would lose all the data you've been studying or learning. It's a soft reset, and it re-energizes the brain. And when you go back to your session, if you are trying to study in flow, that wouldn't have harmed that flow. Some people say it's because of cooling effects of oxygen and more fluid gets to the brain. Some people say it's because of brain-friendly chemicals that get released. Irrespective, I find that it works, although you've got to try it. You've got to try it to test it. That's all I would say. If anyone's interested in these subjects, I put a few names on there, people you might be interested in looking up, Googling, following. I've got more information here. If anyone wanted to send me something, I could send you more information. All of those 4 people are involved with the brain, memory, and creativity. So hopefully that helps. And that was the last slide, Darren.